Hi, everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people-to-people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Today, we'll be discussing the origins of Canadian settler colonialism and whiteness with Dr. Phil Henderson. Specifically, we'll be discussing a recent paper of his on this topic titled Federalism and Settler Imperialism, Racial Regimes, Whiteness, and Conquest in Canadian Constitutionalism. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. And without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Phil Henderson. Okay, Phil, thanks for being here with us. Why don't you start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Ashwin, for having me. My name's Phil Henderson. I'm a settler scholar who lives in Toronto, and I'm currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto's Department of Political Science, as well as an adjunct research professor in the School of Canadian Studies at Carleton University.
Great. So we're here to discuss Phil's paper published in the Canadian Journal of Political Science in 2014, titled Federalism and Settler Imperialism, Racial Regimes, Whiteness, and Conquest in Canadian Constitutionalism. So the way we're going to do this is, Phil is going to start out with an overview of sort of his a breakdown of the paper, and I'll follow up with questions. But before we do that, I think it's important to start by defining some key terms for those who may not be familiar, and even if you are, to brush up on your knowledge of this. So let's first define what is section 9124 of the Canadian Constitution.
Great, yeah. So the Canadian Constitution is a pretty sprawling set of documents that includes things reaching as far back into history as the Magna Carta, the Royal Proclamation, but its most defining document is almost certainly the British North America Act of 1867. And pertinent to the conversation that we're about to have for the relationship between federalism and whiteness and settler imperialism in the Canadian context, the British North America Act has two sections, Section 91 and Section 92, that outline the federal nature of the Canadian state, dividing powers between the jurisdictions of the federal government in Section 91 and the jurisdictions of the 10 provinces in Section 92. And Section 91, Clause 24, is a really crucially important element in the British North America Act because it provides for the federal government of Canada jurisdiction over, and I quote, land, Indians and lands reserved for the Indians, which is to say that amongst a series of other jurisdictional responsibilities, Section 9124 of the British North America Act gives the federal government of Canada sole jurisdiction over an entire group of peoples, i.e., nations, that are racialized in the constitutional language of the country as so-called Indians. These are the indigenous nations of northern North America who have been deracinated of their political sovereignty as part of the process of colonization and the formation of the Canadian constitutional order, racializing them as Indians and therefore subjects of and wards of the federal government of Canada.
Thanks for that, Phil. You also mentioned in that response the Royal Proclamation of 1763. Could you go into that? And also perhaps the Seven-Year War as well.
Yeah, so really briefly, the Seven-Year War is a major international conflict that occurs in the midpoint of the 18th century. So it terminates in 1763 with the defeat of the French in North America by the British and their allies. And marking the end of the conflict, the British Crown issued what was called the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which did a number of things. But in brief, it was designed to outline the terms of governance that the British Empire was going to be pursuing in its relationship with the newly subjected peoples in territories that it had conquered, having defeated the French in North America. So, in particular, the Acadian population, the Canadien or Quebecois population, and the indigenous nations whose territories all of the prior populations were in the process of settling themselves upon. And the Royal Proclamation is really important for a number of reasons. In the first, it is a assimilationist document in terms of its orientation to especially the Canadien Quebecois population. It sought to bar Roman Catholics and Francophones from holding public offices within the newly emerging and nascent state structures in British North America, and in so doing to provide for an emergent Protestant and Anglo supremacism amongst settler populations in those territories. But it also, interestingly and contradictorily, provided the recognition of forms of especially territorial rights for indigenous nations. And its most important recognition was to place an ostensible limit on westward expansion of settlement in North America. This eventually becomes a major point of contention with what become the 13 colonies that join the American Revolution against British rule. But from the point of view of indigenous peoples in North America, the Royal Proclamation is particularly interesting and important because it provides, within the framework of British common law, a recognition of their territorial rights as having been affirmed by the British Crown, that settlers were not to enter into territories of indigenous nations westward of their existing colonies without having entered into treaties with those nations. And so this actually comes to define in large part the constitutional relationship that exists between settlers and indigenous peoples within British North America, even as it's rejected by what become the American colonies following the American Revolutionary War. And so a lot of indigenous peoples will cite the Royal Proclamation as something akin to a Magna Carta within Canadian constitutionalism, because it is one of the first recognitions of them as constitutionally affirmed subjects.
That's great. Dominion status.
Dominion status, yes. So fast forwarding a little bit, Dominion status is something that we'll probably discuss a fair bit over the course of going through the paper, because unlike some of the other stuff that we've been saying or talking about so far, this is really a thing that's invented at the point of 1867. It is a truly Canadian innovation within the realm of the British imperial world system. So while there was emerging principles across the 18th and 19th century of settler self-rule, it's really codified in the British North America Act of 1867, which creates an independent Canadian polity in the form of Dominion status, which is to say, or is often described as something like a junior status within the British imperial system. I wanted to quote here from Robbie McVeigh and Bill Rolston's book on the unfinished revolution in Ireland, where they describe Dominion status, though, as at once this domain of freedom and self-rule that's produced within the British imperial system, but one that is only devolved and is designed to be devolved specifically to white settler populations. And so McVeigh and Rolston write, Dominions were all explicitly racial formations. Power had been devolved to their settler colonial rather than to their native populations. Their self-governing status was predicated on their whiteness. It was this quality that was reason to qualify them for this specific position within the imperial hierarchy. And so while Canada is the first colony within the British imperial system to get Dominion status, between 1867 and the Balfour Declaration of 1926, that status is also devolved to Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, Newfoundland, and South Africa, which are distinct amongst British colonial holdings, specifically because they are polities in which a white settler population is in control of the state apparatuses. And so you can think of Dominion status, yes, as this junior status that exists within the imperial system, but it also carves out, really importantly, a jurisdictional space and a territorial domain in which those settler populations become responsible for the expansion of imperial conquest. In the case of Canada, this is the northern portion of North America. In the case of Australia, it's the continent itself. In the case of South Africa, it's much of southern Africa. So as Dominion status is solidified there, the white settler population begins its rapid expansion of the borders of South Africa northward into present-day Namibia, etc. And so rather than merely a junior status within empire, part of what I'm arguing for over the course of this paper is to see Dominion status as a jurisdiction of imperial conquest that's specifically recognized as being offloaded to settlers within a given territory as having that responsibility for pursuing expansion.
And throughout the paper, you sort of distinguish between settler colonialism and settler imperialism. In the title itself, you have settler imperialism. How do you distinguish between those?
This is a kind of one of the central contentions of the paper itself. And I'm not somebody who really wants to get overly hung up on the distinction. If people are very comfortable continuing to use settler colonialism, I'm very fine with that. But one of the things that I wanted to draw attention to is the way in which settler colonialism as a framework often anachronizes or retroactively projects backwards present day borders and present day political systems. So we talk about Canadian settler colonialism as a very real phenomenon, but oftentimes it's discussed as if the thing that we recognize today as the state of Canada's borders were always already sitting there, merely waiting to be discovered by the settlers that were coming against it. And so there's this internal or domesticating logic that I think gets sort of embedded within the way that people imagine colonialism. And the shift to imperialism is to highlight the conquering nature of the polities that were set up. That in 1867, the thing that we now call the Canadian state really clung to the Laurentian Seaway, to the east coast of North America, and that it was a project of conquest that was needed to build the behemoth of the state that we have today in terms of its territorial acquisitions. And the same is true of Australia, the same is true of South Africa, etc. So my goal is to both first to shift away from this notion that the state system that we have was already preordained, even at the time of the transfer of self-rule from the imperial parliament to settlers. But then it's also to suggest that even once those borders are established, one of the ways in which settler rule manifests is not merely in colonial processes within those borders, but within the imperial processes of the world system as a whole. And I mean, this is extremely evident when we think about the nature of the American settler polity, that it is, in fact, not merely the American empire that is at the center of the world system today, but that it is, in fact, a settler empire, and that it has premised its imperial power on the suppression of indigenous nations' sovereignty within its borders, and then the conquest of other nations external to its borders. And this is readily apparent in many critical studies of the Canadian state, but it's often very bifurcated in terms of how people think about it. On the one hand, you have a lot of scholars and activists who will think about and critique the nature of settler colonialism within Canada, but due to time or political commitments, etc., are not always attentive to the role that the Canadian state plays within the global system. And the same is true in reverse as well, where you have many really excellent critics about the role that Canada plays within the world system that often do not integrate into their analysis the fundamental nature of the colonial situation within Canada. And my hope is that the language of settler imperialism kind of gives us the way of thinking that denaturalizes the inside outside bordered notion of where the Canadian state takes place as a political formation, in order to think about it as being merely in the world and not having, and I shouldn't say not having, but not having any kind of legitimate place there if we were to refuse it to have such.
That's great, and that's quite important. Okay, so before we get into an overview of the paper itself, I wanted to ask, what are sort of the motivations for the arguments you're making in this paper? Why is the content of this paper important? And what should one take away from the findings and insights from this paper?
My real hope is that the paper, as a political intervention outside of its scholarly intervention, is that it's going to encourage people to think about the state formation process within Canada as inextricably tied to processes of colonialism, but also imperialism writ large. That the thing that we call the Canadian state has a constitutive relationship to global processes of dispossession, accumulation, and exploitation. And so, in every kind of corner of the argument, what I'm really attempting to get folks to do is to see that it's not merely an incidental or epiphenomenal relationship between how the institutions of Canadian government got built and their apparent and very clear relationship to processes of empire around the world. And I'm hoping that the line of argument then gives folks who are engaged in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle some toeholds and avenues by which to think about that constitutive relationship, that the state itself was formed to do a particular thing within the world system and does it very well, but also then to highlight, and this is part of my methodological approach, to highlight that it was formed to do that out of a series of constituent parts that didn't necessarily fit together in that way. And I hope that part of the dialectical approach of the paper is to say that while it does this process of reproducing imperial social relations quite well, it also is rife with contradictions in terms of how that occurs, some of which have been extremely salient at various times over the history of state development within the Canadian context, and could be repoliticized in various ways going forward again. So it's to try to really develop a social theory of settler statecraft in short.
Great. Those are some really important points, and I think we'll come back to a bunch of them toward the end. But for now, Phil, you can go ahead, take it away in terms of giving us an overview of the arguments you're making in this paper and what we should take away from it.
Great. So yeah, I'm going to sort of move through this at a fairly high level and fairly cursorily because I know that we've got some really great questions that'll dive into some of the specifics here. But I think maybe to start us off, the paper itself was motivated by two primary concerns, which we've kind of touched upon already, but I'll reiterate them here in greater specificity. The first was the growth of conversations around decolonization is something that really motivated me to write this paper, in part because, as I alluded to already, I could feel in a lot of these conversations that the relationship between the state and its institutions and colonial processes was, at best, relatively under-theorized in a lot of this decolonization discussion, but also at worst was treated as epiphenomenal, as in to say that the state and its institutions did colonialism, but maybe were not in and of themselves colonial, or that there was some type of gap that existed there that it made it possible to have conversations like, quote unquote, decolonizing Canada, rather than to say that Canada itself was produced in order to produce and reproduce colonial relationships. And I think to be sort of maybe a little bit pointed about the issue that's at stake here is I think not only did it render this very thin conception about the relationship between the formation of the Canadian state and colonial social relationships, but it also produced a notion of decolonization that I found to be relatively underthought and potentially very fraught with pitfalls. It oftentimes sounds like people are talking about something like decolonization in one state, as if one could carve Canada out of a global system of imperialism and produce decolonized relationships here. And therefore, I was concerned that there was sort of an absenting of the entirety of the rest of the world from this type of analysis, which is problematic on a bunch of levels. Most readily, of course, is that even in terms of what it would mean to pursue decolonization in one state, many Indigenous nations whose territories are currently colonized by the Canadian state straddle the border, right? So what would it mean to decolonize Canada even if that were possible under current political conjunctures? That doesn't seem particularly likely, but say it was, what would that mean for, say, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, whose territories straddle into upstate New York and other American states? Could this trajectory actually be a meaningful one, especially if the Americans are not pursuing something similar? So I wanted to really address how we're thinking about decolonization in a thicker sense in terms of how we're identifying the problem of colonialism, and then also how we're thinking about what the necessary politics of decolonization mean. And then the second thing that really motivated the paper was, as I also alluded to develop a framework that gets us beyond the limitations of dominant accounts of settler colonialism, which I take to be one, insufficiently materialist in their analysis, often absenting questions of political economy from their account of both where settler colonialism comes from, what it seeks to do, and how one might struggle against settler colonialism as a social relationship. But two, I also was interested in getting us beyond the methodologically nationalist approach that much of the settler colonial studies literature implicitly adopts. Again, the way in which it obscures the fact that Canada necessarily exists within a global system of imperialism and is actually quite central to the reproduction of that system. And I wanted to do all of this in a way that I thought also would take seriously the particularity of colonial situations. So to not just be sort of taking up a flippantly anarchistic critique of the state, but rather took seriously that states are social relationships that are built through the articulation of particular social forces over time. And so I wanted to actually think about what it would mean to both get beyond methodological nationalism, but also to see that the conditions of settler colonialism, settler imperialism are deeply defined in context by the state policies that are pursued by and that are driven by particular interest groups, and to understand how that works. And so as a Canadianist, I obviously did all of this in the context of the Canadian state as a political formation, which I thought it easiest to sort of make these sort of high level theoretical points by returning to debates that were held in the legislature of the Canadian province and of the Imperial Parliament in London prior to the passage of the British North America Act in 1867. And so a lot of the argument of the article actually hinges on the things that people like John A. Macdonald or George Brown or politicians in Britain were saying at the time, because they reveal quite clearly what the intentions of these imperial and colonial state actors were. And I think that it's pretty explicit moving through these debates that these men were in the process of designing institutional frameworks that enabled the relatively rapid continental expansion of the settler polity within the ambit of the British Empire. And to offer just a taste of the things that I touch on in the article, which we've already sort of started to outline here, I'm really interested in two specific institutional innovations that made the British North America Act of 1867 a successful constitutional document in the specific sense that it has formed a stable settler polity that has persisted over time since 1867. And the first of those is federalism, which, as I detail in the article, is probably considered amongst political scientists the most central institution, enabling the previously disparate colonies of British North America to unite into a single state. And very often, this is treated as a purely technical governing mechanism, that it allowed for a division of powers that let these colonies come together. But what I suggest over the course of the paper is that it's not just a matter of technical governance, but it has really profound sociological implications, because what it also did was it was the technique by which previously conflicting segments of the overall settler population were brought into relatively coherent institutional alignment with one another, which is to say that previously insurmountable social antagonisms, French versus English, Protestant versus Catholic, etc., were able to be constitutionally mediated by federalism, because what it did was it produced the arrangement by which a shared project of conquest could be pursued. And out of this, I argue that what federalism does in the Canadian context, at least, and I'm not making a broader claim, I think it's fairly case specific, but it constitutionalized whiteness. It gave French Catholics and English Protestants the space in which they could imagine themselves not merely as French Catholics and English Protestants, but as white settlers who were engaged in a shared project of the dispossession of Indigenous nations. And then the second institution that I am really interested in here is dominion status, which we've already talked about a bit. So just to briefly highlight here, what I think this innovation of dominion status did was it accelerated the already ongoing devolution of self-rule from the imperial parliament in London to settler elites in Ottawa and also in the provincial capitals, ascribing within that jurisdiction a responsibility to settler elites for pursuing continental imperial conquest within a defined geographic territory, which for Canada was the northern portion of North America. But I also think that we should take this really seriously as a profound innovation that dramatically renovates the entire world system of the British Empire at the time, from a relatively homogeneous political order up until the latter part of the 19th century into a political order that from the latter part of the 19th century into the early 20th century is increasingly heterogeneous in the sense that more and more settler polities gain dominion status and begin pursuing their own forms of imperial conquest. And I think this is both important to understand how the trajectory moves in terms of like the actual practical politics, but I also think it's an important object lesson in a non unidirectional account of history, because I think a lot of the narratives of, say, Canadian independence move through a liberal account that there's an unfolding of progress, that the independence of the Canadian state was a form of, at the very, I mean, at one point people would have used the language of decolonization, but I think today people have been at least somewhat disciplined into saying, at the very least, it's a greater degree of self-government that maybe is tending towards greater inclusivity over time. And I think taking really seriously the politics that are at stake in each of these transitionary moments reveals that there's nothing like progress or tolerance or collective emancipation that's at stake here. It's the transference of the right to govern others and to dispossess them of their territories from one ruling class to, you could say, a comprador or to a delegated ruling class in a settler polity. And so I hope that it sort of reveals that this is not a unidirectional thing, but actually goes some way towards explaining why you have, and I only briefly allude to this at the end of the article, why you have some of the most grotesque forms of white supremacism in the mid 20th century, in the case of Southern Rhodesia, making claims on self-rule that look very similar to the claims that were made by the likes of John A. Macdonald and George Brown in 1867 in Canada. And in fact, that Canada provides the constitutional example of the types of right to self-rule that these white settlers in Rhodesia imagine themselves to be the inheritors of.
Great. Thank you for that, Phil. So, even sort of when you were talking about the Royal Proclamation, you noted that, this was a process by which the Crown effectively recognized Indigenous nations and had provisions, to perhaps not, I think the language is to not molest or to not disturb them, something along those lines. And then, of course, the innovation, as you say, the innovation of federalism and dominion status, was sort of a way to redistribute imperial sovereignty away from London, and in this case toward Ottawa to, expand imperial conquest across the continent and to expand westward. So in this line, I sort of just wanted to ask if you could elucidate what were some of the forms of national or international sovereignty that various Indigenous nations had at the time that the settler project in Canada was being built.
Definitely. So, I mean, this is a whole field of study on its own. It's a much longer conversation. And so I'll just say off the top, the answer is varied, very disparate, and quite heterogeneous. But to give a couple of examples, probably the most famous, at least amongst non-Indigenous folks is the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois Confederacy, but this is a union between six, or depending on the time period, seven distinct nations that entered into a confederated organization of shared territorial governance and collective self-defense with one another. So this is largely around the Great Lakes region, particularly Lake Ontario, across what's contemporarily Quebec, Ontario, and upstate New York. And plenty has been written about it, but it's quite deeply democratic and matrilineal form of confederated self-government in which each of the nations is both responsible for their own jurisdiction, but also for collective self-defense of one another, and then they have autonomy within that. And so a lot of people actually will root the very notion of federalism in the example that's provided by the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, although I think Haudenosaunee scholars themselves have pushed back that the form of federalism that's been developed within settler polities is pretty impoverished in terms of how it understands the democratic right to self-rule of its constituent parts versus the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Contrasting that, say, with West Coast nations, which typically did not pursue confederated forms of self-government, but rather built their forms of self-government around the Longhouse, where feasting protocols were extremely central. Fishing was one of the primary modes of economic activity, and so there's also a multiplicity of very independent nationalisms that exist along the West Coast that are still reflected today in the really rich linguistic diversity amongst West Coast First Nations. Yeah, and I mean, we could talk a little bit about things like the Three Fires Confederacy of the Anishinaabe, which is the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa. But by and large, it's probably helpful for your audience to think about the fact that prior to the emergence of the settler polities in North America, there was a superabundance of heterogeneous and overlapping forms of Indigenous self-governance that cut across or move within the realm of nationhood, clan, matrilineal descent, and territorial self and co-governance. So it's something that can really only be dealt with in its specificity, but one of the real elements of what settler colonialism meant was the displacement of that very heterogeneous and varied form of emplaced Indigenous national sovereignties with a very singular and unified version of settler sovereignty that seeks to deny the pre-existence of Indigenous sovereignties.
Okay, so throughout the paper, and you've also mentioned this, that you know, uh, confederation, dominion status, these were innovations in creating a settler class unified around whiteness, especially, and we'll get into that in a bit. But you particularly mention in the paper that the settler class at the core of the Canadian imperial project is, quote, internally differentiated. What does that mean? And how is understanding class relevant to answering that question?
So in this case, I think it's worth saying that in general, I think that class itself is always best understood as a way by which to name the movement of dominant social relations that contain within it a variety of articulated sub-elements. So I'm making a case about specifically what it looks like in the Canadian context, but I do think that this is a helpful way of thinking about class formation generally. And to answer it in the specifics of the Canadian context, the settler class, as we've sort of hedged around here, emerges out of the European populations that engage in processes of colonization throughout North America. And in Europe, and for many of the early years in North America too, but especially in Europe, many of the peoples who would become settlers in North America would not have understood themselves as having any form of common cause with other settlers. And that's because of things like ethno-linguistic divisions. So again, French versus English, religious divisions, which were extremely deep within the European context, especially along lines of Catholic versus Protestant, Calvinist, etc. And what happens in the formation of settlers as a relatively coherent class is that those particular divisions are set aside, as are the underlying division between what is sort of the classic terms of class analysis, the owners and the workers, or the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, in the specific sense that the antagonisms of those classes are not actually eliminated. There's still those who labor and those who own, but they're mediated through a shared project of conquest, which in some cases actually does elevate proletarianized subjects displaced from Europe through forms of enclosure, dispossession, etc., into forms of, at the very least, petty bourgeois status as they enter into processes of settlement in North America, acquiring land and homesteading, for instance, right? So it produces incentives to, amongst, say, working people, to enter into alliance with the bosses in order to acquire more forms of property, which then enter into circuits of capital circulation and accumulation, which ultimately one could surmise, and we're probably witnessing the consequences of that today, redound to the benefit of the big capitalists, the proper bourgeoisie, but do provide real terms of material benefits to those who collaborate with one another, or with the bourgeoisie, that is. And in this argument, I'm more or less following exactly the line of thought that historians like Gerald Horne have developed, which is to say that settler colonialism is really best understood as a form of class collaborationism on the part of one segment of the proletarian masses, i.e., white workers in this case, with the bourgeoisie in general. And so settlers are really helpfully understood as a class, but a class that contains within itself its own contradictions.
Could you touch a little bit more on sort of, you outlined the sort of the relationship of ownership between owners and workers as sort of part of those internal differentiations between within the settler class. Could you also talk a little bit more about what you call the intra-settler alliance between the Anglophones and the Francophones, and the constitution
Yeah,
of the settler class between those two groups as well?
yeah. So in the Canadian context, especially, this is a really common through line in terms of how the governing elite is dealing with the problem from their point of view of relatively stymied colonial and imperial expansion throughout the 19th century. So, folks who are familiar with the history of Canadian constitutionalism have probably heard of something called Lord Durham's report, which is a report that John Lambton, then the self ascribed Lord Durham, wrote following the rebellions of Upper and Lower Canada in the 1840s. And in that report, Durham very famously described that what he found in the Canadas was two nations warring in the bosom of a single state. And what he meant there was not, as I think people today might imagine, a war between settlers and indigenous peoples, which was very much ongoing at the time, but rather a war between various parts of the settler population, French and English, Catholic and Protestant. And part of the recommendations that were developed by Lord Durham and that were implemented in the form of emerging self-rule, which ultimately culminates in 1867 with the British North America Act, is techniques that will ensure that that social antagonism that exists within the settler population are mediated into forms of whiteness that are institutionalized that then can actually supersede these social antagonisms. And so you can think about all of this as the formation of an alliance within the settler population, which is it's inside of it and actually enables it to function as a conquering and expansionary settler population. And it's only by achieving that in the British North America Act that they actually get over this relatively stymied and sort of minimally expansionist form of colonization that had defined the polity for so much of the 19th century.
And of course, you mentioned Upper and Lower Canada. Just as a briefer, Upper Canada sort of maps onto the Anglophone parts of today's Central Canada region, so corresponding broadly to Ontario. Lower Canada, French speaking, broadly mapping onto today's Quebec. So in that, yeah, so given what you've been saying about this, how do you, and this might be a little bit of an aside, but I'm curious because it's, I lived in Montreal for a while. How do you assess the claim by some Quebec nationalists that, they are indeed a colonized people, they can't be settlers, they deny their sort of settler history? Yeah, your thoughts.
Right. At the risk of entering into territory where I could be accused of speaking out of turn, I'll say that probably what's at stake here is a mistaking of the notion of the relatively subordinated and clearly deliberately underdeveloped status that the Quebecois had within Confederation from 1867 until the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, which is pretty uncontroversial, I think, to say that relative to other portions of the settler population and relative to other white communities in North America as a whole, the Quebecois were the most underdeveloped region of the Canadian polity at the provincial level, at least, until the 1960s. And so there's what Stanley Ryerson in his book Unequal Union calls a uneven terms of integration that are at stake here, which is not the same thing as alleviating the actual responsibility for the ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples. It's to say that the full privileges and benefits that are extracted from that are not being devolved to the Quebec population, but that's within a continuum that one could say that all working settlers don't get the full benefit of it. There's a class stratification that exists there. That doesn't mean that they're not settlers. It just means that it's uneven along very particular lines. But the role that national consciousness plays in that is a really important one because not only does it highlight and then maybe politicize that in ways that are unhelpful, as you're saying here, with this notion that it's being used to sort of posture as if the Quebecois are somehow not responsible for forms of colonization that occur within their own territories. And I think Haudenosaunee communities at Akwesasne, at Kanesatake, Ganawage would be very quick to say, like, no, there is very clearly a colonial relationship between the Quebecois and our people. But there are also points at which the national political consciousness of the Quebecois moved in different directions as well. I don't think, to my knowledge, it ever really moved towards a direction of solidarity with Indigenous nations, Haudenosaunee in particular, but it did move towards third worldist tendencies at one point, at least among segments of the Quebecois nationalist population. So, in particular, the FLQ in the 1970s was really deeply integrated with liberation struggles led by folks like the Black Panthers in the United States, but also the FLN in Algeria. And so there's a consciousness that's at stake there that is really important in terms of understanding those contradictions that I said are embedded within the Canadian political project, but also that has never really quite grappled with, as you're saying, Ashwin, the centrality of settler colonialism within their own so-called homeland as well.
Sort of very briefly staying on this digression, you mentioned the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s. Could you just briefly outline what that was? And also, as a follow-up to that, do you think that this is also another example of a kind of reconfiguration of the sort of the governing stratum or strata in the Canadian polity to sort of alleviate some of these contradictions between the Anglophone Canadians and the Francophone Canadians following the Quiet Revolution? And we can be brief on this.
Yeah. To answer your second question briefly, yes, I think so. But to do the slightly longer, what is the Quiet Revolution? So this is a period in beginning in the 1950s into the 1960s in which the Quebecois society, but also the province of Quebec as an institution, emerges from a form of internal organization, which was extremely heavily dependent upon the Catholic Church as a consequence of the particular forms of political authority that were established in 1867. And it moves away from that old family compact model where the church was central through the provision of education, health, etc., into what is more recognizable as a modern social democratic welfare state in which the state of Quebec begins to take a much more active and activist role in the development of education, health, national identity, et cetera, et cetera. And you see a major shift within Quebec society away from the quietism, the conservatism of traditional Catholic social norms into a deeply secular form of modern welfarist state provisioning of social goods, basically.
Great, that's helpful. Okay, so coming back to the paper, you talked about in this paper how sort of racialized minorities, including the Chinese, Japanese, and South Asians in today's Canada, had their right to vote withdrawn from them in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, along with several other forms of legislated racism, and that this was due to the growing solidification of whiteness or white identity, which was essential to Canada. That's sort of the argument you're making. So, two things. Could you outline briefly what were some of these sort of racial injustices, I guess you could call them, against non-white minorities that also weren't Indigenous? And then also second, from this, what kind of takeaways, should we come to about the role that race plays for the ruling class in and the state in Canada? Because very often, like episodes like this in Canada's history are sort of framed, like you were saying, as sort of mistakes, or we didn't know any better. Now times have evolved, so we're different now, that kind of thing. So really, outline some of this for us, and highlight what we can take away about you know uh, uh, the role that race plays specifically.
Yeah, I think this is really important because, again, I think to go back to my earlier point, oftentimes I think people imagine the history of so-called race relations within Canada as a progressive unfolding of greater tolerance and inclusivity. But looking very carefully at the history of white supremacist social and political policy within this country, that type of linear progression is really not at all apparent. Actually, you can see plenty of points of regression, which is very instructive to us, I think, in the current moment in which a white revanchist politics is particularly resurgent in North America writ large, but in Canada specifically. We should always guard against the very real possibility of regression on these questions. Things that seem settled can quickly become unsettled very immediately. So to go over some of this, it's really important for people to understand that just something as straightforward as the franchise, the right to vote, has not been uh, a stably achieved right for a lot of non-white communities within the history of the Canadian polity. So, for instance, in the territories that become the province of British Columbia in 1871, the right to vote was actually held by uh, Indigenous peoples and non-white populations as well, prior to British Columbia entering into Confederation. And it's actually as British Columbia enters into Confederation that it begins to withdraw the franchise from a lot of these communities. So in 1872, the year after British Columbia becomes officially part of Confederation, it strips people with Indian status, which is a large chunk of the Indigenous population in Canada, of their right to vote. It also simultaneously strips Chinese descended communities of their right to vote. And what's really critical to understand here is not only the evident injustice at the individual level, but what it actually did was enshrine white minority rule in British Columbia at the time, which it looks actually much more akin to the demographic situation that people are very familiar with in apartheid South Africa, because Chinese descended and Indigenous communities form something like 60% of the population of British Columbia at the time that it enters into Confederation. And so the stripping of their right to vote was very deliberately to establish a white settler polity in British Columbia. And this actually extends further on. So it's 1895 that Japanese descended communities in British Columbia are disenfranchised, and it's 1907 where Southeast Asian communities are similarly disenfranchised as well. Uh, we could look by comparison to Manitoba, which, although it enters into Confederation in, and let me get the year right here, 1870, the full devolution of self-government to the provincial legislature of Manitoba doesn't occur until 1874. And that's a deliberate policy on the part of the federal government of Canada to ensure that white settlers from Ontario, in particular, have moved in sufficient numbers to Manitoba to displace the existing Métis majority within that territory. So, for much of the earliest history of the political formation of the country, there is very clearly a policy of ensuring that democratic self-rule is only devolved where a white demographic majority has, or a white demographic majority has been created through the franchise system at the time. So it's meant to be a form of Herrenvolk democracy, is the technical term for it. We could also think about things like the very famous head tax that are imposed on Chinese workers who come to Canada and build the critical infrastructure of the Pacific Rail. The Komagata Maru is another famous incident in which migrants from Southeast Asia are refused entry to Canada despite the fact that they have the right to move within the British Empire as a whole. And so you can see in Canada's refusal to allow the Komagata Maru entry into the port of Vancouver, the assertion of white sovereignty against the obligations that the Canadian polity has within the imperial system of the British Empire itself. And it's to say that even though we're a part of this, we're asserting that our sovereignty as a white settler polity gives us the right to deny the imperial subjecthood of other non-white people.
Could you elaborate on why this was? So, what role does race play in sort of accumulation or the accumulation of wealth by a certain class of in this case settlers?
It's more complicated than this, but it's understandable through the lens of the production of hyper-exploitable populations. And so what's fundamentally at stake in each of the examples that I have provided is the work that racialization does as a social fiction that produces differences that can then be sites of exploitation. So the racialization of Chinese workers as somehow radically different from white workers becomes the justification for which Chinese workers are paid a tenth or something very similar to what white workers are paid. And you can go similarly and read the legislative debates that occur at the time outlining these differentiations that are built into the wage laws, and they use explicit race science in their thinking about how you can justify this. Notions that members of XYZ racialized community are just physically different from white workers and therefore do not need the sort of protections or the sort of benefits that are accrued to white workers. And so race as a fiction becomes actualized through state policy that enables capital and the state to treat different populations radically distinctly and therefore produce different social outcomes.
That's great. And, like you're saying, sort of racialization can look different in different contexts across time and serve sort of different purposes. And sort of in that vein, I wanted to ask you, because in the paper you talked about how, there were different forms of enclosure, quote, enclosure and confinement, unquote, of Indigenous peoples. So even the way that Indigenous peoples were racialized and thus their relation to work and their relation to the settler polity or settler governance looked different in different places. I think the examples in the paper are between sort of urban areas in British Columbia and in Saskatchewan or in the prairies. Could you just outline some of that briefly?
Yeah, and so this is it kind of takes an almost different tact in that I do think that the language of distinct racialization is helpful here, but in all cases, it's the Indian Act that is used to govern how Indigenous peoples are treated within the Canadian context. But the way in which the clearness of how racialization interacts with forms of accumulation and profit circulation in particular is played out in the context of Indigenous peoples, largely by how the government of Canada and the provincial governments negotiate the size of reserve territories within the Canadian context. So, for instance, in the prairies, where the primary political economy was agricultural, throughout the late 19th century and much of the 20th century, Indigenous peoples were enclosed into relatively large, but also extremely heterogeneous reserve communities as compared to what I'm going to explain on the West Coast here. Not to say that they're actually large, they are fractions of their traditional territories. But the purpose of these types of reserve enclosures was to ensure the greatest amount of territory was opened up throughout the prairies for white settlement and, in particular, white agricultural production. And so there was a massification that was at stake in terms of how the state reorganized Indigenous populations throughout the prairies. Contrast that to the comparatively much smaller and more geographically distributed reserve system that's developed in British Columbia, where the reliance upon Indigenous peoples as laborers, in particular within the canning industries and the logging industries, was much higher. So in the prairies, Indigenous peoples were not seen as agriculturalists. In fact, they were attempted to be displaced so that more agriculture could sweep in. In what becomes British Columbia, at least throughout the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, Indigenous workers are very central in a lot of the industries of British Columbia, in particular fishing, canning, logging. And so their reserves are placed relatively close to urban centers, and they are relatively smaller in order to necessitate engagement in the waged economy versus the form of subsistence farming that could be practiced in somewhat larger reserves elsewhere in the country.
Great, thanks for that, Phil. Okay, so I mean, we've been talking about race and sort of the role that race has played. We talked about how in Confederation, you had the creation of whiteness from two otherwise antagonistic races between the English and French, and that's how they saw it. They saw the English and French as two races. You wouldn't hear that today. I mean, so there was the invention of whiteness to facilitate sort of settler conquest across the continent. I wanted to ask you, how do we think of that in relation to the current racial regime of the Canadian state, specifically as it perhaps relates to multiculturalism? Yeah, any of your thoughts on that?
It's a really good question, um, and one that I think multiculturalism has done a lot to produce some pretty serious ideological confusion on, in terms of the way in which a veneer of multicultural tolerance within Canada has pretty seriously obscured the still very dramatic unevenness of Canadian society and Canada's political economy along racialized lines. And so I don't think it would be overly reductive to say that much of multiculturalism, as pursued and supported by the Canadian state, which it's worth saying is increasingly less interested in even supporting it. So the type of financial transfers that initially defined the multicultural policies of the Canadian state when they primarily went to post-war Ukrainian populations has dropped off dramatically now that what we think of as multiculturalism is much more geographically diverse in terms of the world populations that it's drawn from. But I think the other thing that's at stake is, to the degree that it is still supporting policies of multiculturalism, it's largely in the form of cultural recognition and celebration, absent an attention to the material disparities that define how different communities actually live their social existence. And I think that this is probably intuitively very true and readily apparent to anybody who walks around any city in this country, or even any rural area, and sees who's doing what types of work in the country. Uh, the way in which labor falls along racial lines, I think, is very apparent to anybody who takes the time to think about it. That low wage, high risk service and manual work is almost exclusively a racialized endeavor in this country, whereas high wage and office work is extremely whitened in terms of who gets to do that type of labor. So you could go to a Tim Hortons and see this. You could go to a a apple field in rural Ontario, and you could see this. And I think the other thing that's at stake there is the role that citizenship has come to play in terms of structuring all of this as well. And it's sort of the role of status as citizen or temporary foreign worker or migrant that the Canadian state uses to say that these are not, in fact, racial policies. Rather, they are policies that are race blind, but merely enroll people with different citizenship status into different sectors of the political economy. And that's more or less a canard. I mean, everybody knows why it functions that way. It is explicitly uh, racialized in terms of who actually does the work. It's just that they have the one degree of separation of citizenship as their sort of screen against which they can say it's not officially a racist policy. It's merely a policy that differentiates on the basis of citizenship.
And, this might be speculative, but do you see this kind of a, sort of, I mean, you talked about the racial realities of work on the ground, but of course there is the narrative, um, the ideology of multiculturalism. How do you see that ideology sort of as it relates to continued indigenous dispossession, and sort of perhaps, and this is why I say speculative, but perhaps the recreation or the incorporation of new settlers.
I'm never quite sure about how to speculate on the degree to which it does fully capture the political imagination of new settlers. So maybe I'll park that for just a second and say one of the ways in which the question of multiculturalism does interact with Indigenous politics in Canada is as an attempt at capture, too, is that the sort of sweep of Indigenous claims across the country has been attempted on the part of the government to be reduced to one cultural or a set of cultural claims amongst others. And so indigeneity and its multiplicity is stripped of its sovereignty in the discourse of the Canadian state and becomes cultural. And it therefore sits alongside other multicultural communities within the country rather than being fundamentally about the dispossession of land and the right to the return of that land and the right to govern that land. So that's one thing. I'm not entirely sure how to speculate on the question of new arrivant communities, new settler communities, and the relationship to multiculturalism, only to say that I think that the last year and a half in particular, maybe the last 5 years, around things like the Wet'suwet'en uprising, the so-called discovery of mass graves at residential schools, And I say so-called because Indigenous peoples have told us that those graves have been there for generations at this point. But also Canada's ongoing involvement in the genocide of Palestinians has really revealed to a lot of people, and in particular, I think people in communities that are relatively newly arrived in Canada, the mythology of the multicultural country that it presents itself as. I think a lot of people are very keyed into how thin and performative that is. Sort of my speculation.
Great. Okay, we're sort of angling toward the end here. I wanted to ask, because the last sort of section of the paper talks about sort of the global dimensions of Dominion status. Wanted you to sort of touch on that for a bit, but also maybe two things I would add on to that is I'm curious how, and in your view, how is the world system changing in this era that Dominion status was innovated? How is the world system changing in such a way that necessitated sort of a reorganization or a rejigging of the British Empire that then resulted in something like Dominion status? And then, starting in Canada, but then, like you said, sort of proliferating throughout the world in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, etc. And also, I mean, one of the countries, one of the names that we didn't hear that received Dominion status is India, and there were also sort of quite a bit of discussions around that on the British imperial side, but also within Indian independence struggles. So yeah, I put a lot there. If you can, yeah, so see if you can touch on them.
Yeah, I think the place that I'll start is sort of the implied why that's at stake here. And there are many different ways of attacking this question, but I think the angle that's probably most useful to come at initially is a pretty banal recognition that the interests of a settler population and the interests of a metropolitan population, while related, are not identical to one another. And that produces distinct trajectories and designs on the part of both of those groups that might move together for some time and might be realigned, but they might also diverge from one another. And part of what Dominion status was meant to do was to ensure that they could move together to the greatest degree possible. So we could think back to, as I was sort of alluding to, the central role of the American Revolution in defining the sort of schism between a settler polity and its metropolitan core. And part of the lesson that was learned on the part of the British Empire there is that as a settler polity becomes increasingly confident in its own capacity to engage in processes of dispossession and of accumulation, and especially as they develop the social forces that are capable of pursuing that with a relative degree of autonomy from the metropolitan core, that they will pursue that if they need to in antagonism of the metropolitan core. And this is still a dynamic that we see today. This is part of why so much of the confusion over the situation during, the Biden regime in its relationship to Israel was harebrained in terms of how people were understanding it. It's very clear that there's a set of interests that are at stake in Israel that are distinct in some ways from the set of interests that are at stake in Washington. And Biden was attempting very rapidly to try to draw them back together. And Trump is doing the same thing now, right? So this is actually a pretty old observation in the literature on settler colonialism. It goes back to Emmanuel Arrighi. And it's to say that Dominion status emerges at a point in the development of a variety of settler polities throughout the British Empire, where it's plausible to imagine them breaking away from the empire, and therefore Dominion status is devolved in order to provide an institutional arrangement in which they'll stay within that ambit for as long as is possible. And it really does serve basically that sort of articulating function, that it keeps all of these things moving together with one another. I've kind of lost the other elements of your question. So if you could remind me of them, I'll try to tackle them here.
Yeah, no, that covered most of it. Yeah, maybe if you could, because in the paper itself, you did touch on sort of, you know, Dominion status explicitly being racialized and explicitly um, coinciding with the emergence and the consolidation of whiteness in the case of Canada. Um, how did that relate to other parts of the British Empire?
Right. Um, which is a really excellent question. So, as I said at the sort of start, the component parts of the British Empire that have Dominion status devolved to them between 1867 and 1926 are relatively small in the both the like territorial but also the human sweep of who the British Empire claimed for itself. So it's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Newfoundland, which was its own dominion very briefly, and Ireland and South Africa. And this obviously leaves out millions, if not even at that time, billions of people in terms of who the British Empire saw fit to devolve self government to. So, India is a primary example where, in the debates over the Statute of Westminster, which in 1931 fully codifies what Dominion status means, you have famous white supremacists like Winston Churchill openly declaring that India will never be allowed to achieve Dominion status within his view of where the British Empire is tending towards. And it's explicitly because of racist thinking that's at stake. It's only meant to be devolved to populations or to polities in which there's a population of sufficiently self-conscious white settlers capable of exercising the state apparatuses within a loyalty to the British Empire itself.
That's great. Thanks, Phil. Um, okay, so approaching the end here, I sort of see the through line of your paper and your argument as, the fact that Confederation and Canadian settler expansion were not inevitable facts of history, but rather contingent conjunctures that required an active effort active effort at joining disparate interests together. Um, so, expand a little bit for us if you can, why this concept of contingency is important to note when studying history more broadly and obviously when studying this case in particular.
Yeah. And I should say off the top that I think that this is a really good catch on your part because I am attempting to chart my way through some sort of tricky waters here. On the one hand, the emphasis on contingency is certainly meant to sort of move past deterministic accounts of any of this, that settler colonialism or that in particular Canadian colonialism was inevitable in any way inevitable as an emergent historic force. That there are plenty of places, which I'll highlight here in a second, at which not only was it maybe possible to turn it back, but to defeat it, in fact. And on the other hand, I'm also trying to sort of weave my way through this in a way that doesn't just redound to purely free floating notions of agential or spontaneous political activity. That we have to see this as there's somewhere in between. And I think the work of Stuart Hall is particularly helpful here to pursue a form of Marxism without guarantees, that we can see the way in which history informs the actions that are possible within a given moment, but it doesn't predetermine where those move to, that there are many different intervening factors that are at stake. And to provide, a couple of examples of this, I think one of the most profound accounts in my mind of the real contingency of the Canadian imperial project comes to us through the Métis historian Howard Adams, who provides a really rich historical materialist account of the Northwest resistance to Canadian imperialism. And in particular, what he notes that is of relevance to the conversation we've been having is that at Red River, for much of the early period resisting Canadian encroachment, there was actually a form of alliance between people who we would describe as white settlers and Métis farmers in that area, and that they were united in their opposition to the encroachment of the Canadian state because they understood that along with that would come a reorganization of the land and the basic social relationships that they had predicated their entire society on. Now, what Adams shows over the course of his excellent book, Prison of Grass, is the way in which both brute military force on the part of the Northwest Mounted Police and the Ontario contingencies that were sent to invade Red River, but also the promise of whiteness as a form of constitutionalized inclusion, were used to repress Métis resistance and to incentivize white settler collaboration with the Project of Canada. And he shows there that the real capacity that was extant at Red River to effectively stall the westward expansion of the Canadian political project was broken by these two forms of activity on the part of the Canadian state: military repression and the promise of inclusion of certain parts of the population there into the fold of whiteness and settler citizenship. And but for that, it's very hard to imagine Canada as we do today, because Red River sat at a really essential geographic nodal point in terms of enabling expansion westward into the prairies, northward into the Hudson's Bay Basin, et cetera, et cetera. And so that type of moment in history is really important to understand, that it didn't have to break the way that it did. There are reasons why it broke the way that it did, but they're not outside of history. They're very much within the realm of historic sort of swerves. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, and that's this emphasis on contingency, I think, is important for us today as well, because contingencies continue to exist today. And in fact, I'll read two important quotes, I would say, from the paper. The first is, quote, "The racial regime of Canadian settler imperialism is in a near constant state of re-articulation," unquote. The second quote is, quote, "The potential for rupture or disarticulation has always been there," unquote. So yeah, I mean, very much in line with what you're saying. So yeah, I mean, maybe, to close us out, last word on sort of why this is important for us today. And, perhaps what is the state of the points of rupture in the Canadian project today? That's sort of big, but take it however which way you'd like.
It is big, but it's also a really good question. I think that they are many, but I think that they're distinct from what they were historically. So we've just touched on the sort of moment at which whiteness is really extended outwards at Red River. And we've discussed a little bit about a period of Quebecois nationalism that was third worldist in its orientation. And I kind of think that those are really important historical examples to think about, but the forms of rupture that I think are most central to an anti-colonial politic within the Canadian context right now are probably best located in slightly distinct spaces. Um, for instance, I think one of the central places to look for these forms of rupture right now is, as we were talking about a little while ago, in racialized communities that are experiencing forms of hyperexploitation. And in particular, I think thinking about the relationship between the hyperexploitation of racialized communities, and in particular of people with contingent forms of citizenship status or temporary status in the country, as both occupying key sites within the political economy in the form of food production, in the form of logistics, that those are really central places where organizing could take place to use that type of social power that they have in those positions and to articulate it with forms of indigenous resistance in the country as well. And we've seen some early signs of this actually in the form of who it is that actually tends to support the most radical forms of indigenous resistance when they arise across the country in the form of blockades and that kind of thing. The other place that I think the polity is sort of um, at risk of exposure to its own deep contradictions at this point are in something like the housing market, which has produced a really serious form of alienation amongst a large portion of its population that could be politicized. And so I think of the rise of tenant unions as a particularly politically possible moment in the country. And if tenant unions both can begin to build the type of social power that's necessary to confront the landlord class in this country, but also to do so in a way that doesn't merely make appeals to what I'll call really broadly settler normativity in terms of attempting to reground the politics of tenant power in a claim to the occupation of indigenous lands, but rather in a way that would seek to return those lands to indigenous nations, that we could be talking about a really serious and potent political force at that point. And there is some reason for optimism there. I know that there's a really deep relationship between political militants from Six Nations and houseless organizers in Toronto. And that, especially around the sort of in the depths of COVID, when the Toronto Police Services were raiding houseless encampments across the city, a lot of the solidarity activists from 1492 Land Back Lane came and stood in solidarity, attempting to stop the police violence against houseless people. And so that type of interlocking assessment of how the land question is experienced by tenants in urbanized areas as necessarily related to the prior question of indigenous dispossession is, to me, a point at which we could see a real shift in the political consciousness of a lot of people across the country.
That was our conversation with Dr. Phil Henderson. You can find both this paper of his and the rest of his work linked in the description. And once again, you can follow us on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. Reach out to us to let us know your thoughts and feedback. Thank you again, and we'll see you next time.